The sun was just beginning to rise when Daniel Reed entered the towering glass doors of Reed Innovations, a company that bore his name but rarely his presence. Dressed in a plain navy blue janitor's uniform, he pushed a well-worn cleaning cart into the elevator, pressed the button for the 14th floor, and leaned back against the metallic walls as the elevator hummed upward. To the world, Daniel Reed was a reclusive but shrewd CEO who had built an empire on the values of innovation, hard work, and integrity. But to his employees, he was just a name on a plaque, a figure rarely seen in the halls of the company he had founded. And that was exactly how Daniel wanted it, at least for now. For the past 6 months, Daniel had taken on the guise of a janitor to observe the company culture at its most unfiltered. It was a drastic move, but Daniel believed that leadership wasn't about issuing commands from a high tower. It was about understanding people at every level of the organization. He wanted to see how his employees treated each other, especially those they considered invisible. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and Daniel pushed his cart into the bustling 14th floor hallway. This was the operations hub, where the heart of the company pulsed with activity. Employees were already moving briskly, clutching coffee cups and murmuring hurried greetings to one another. Few spared a glance for the man in the janitor's uniform. Daniel preferred it that way. It allowed him to blend in and observe without the filter of his title. Today, however, his focus was on one individual, Thomas Blake, the senior operations manager. Thomas had a reputation in the company. On paper, he was efficient, organized, and results-driven. But whispers of his abrasive attitude and condescending behavior had reached Daniel's ears through anonymous employee surveys. As Daniel quietly cleaned the glass walls of the conference rooms, he kept a careful eye on Thomas, who was striding through the office with an air of self-importance. "Sarah," Thomas barked at a young woman sitting at her desk near the window. "Where's the monthly performance report? It should have been on my desk an hour ago." "I'm working on it, sir," Sarah replied nervously, her fingers flying over her keyboard. "I just need another 15 minutes. 15 minutes? Thomas scoffed, leaning over her desk with an exaggerated sigh. "Do you understand what a deadline means? Or do I need to spell it out for you?" Sarah's cheeks flushed red as her coworkers averted their eyes. Thomas straightened up and turned on his heel, muttering under his breath as he walked away. Daniel tightened his grip on the handle of his mop. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed Thomas belittling employees, but it never got easier to watch. The morning progressed, and Daniel continued his silent work, taking mental notes of Thomas's interactions. At one point, Thomas nearly collided with Daniel in the hallway. "Watch where you're going," Thomas snapped, not even bothering to look up. "And clean up that corner by the break room. It's a mess." "Of course, sir," Daniel replied evenly, suppressing the urge to say more. As Daniel mopped the floor near the break room, he overheard a group of employees discussing Thomas. "Did you hear how he chewed out Sarah this morning?" one of them whispered. "It's like he enjoys making people feel small." "I know," another replied. "But what can we do? He's the boss, and HR doesn't seem to care." Daniel frowned. The culture of fear and helplessness that Thomas had cultivated was a stark contrast to the values Daniel had tried to instill in his company. He decided it was time to dig deeper, beneath the surface. The next day, Daniel arrived at the office even earlier than usual. The building was still quiet, bathed in the soft glow of pre-dawn light. Daniel preferred this time. It gave him space to reflect on the day ahead without the cacophony of office life bearing down on him. He took a moment to adjust his janitor's uniform, tightening the straps of his cleaning cart as he mentally prepared for another day of observation. Today, Daniel wasn't just looking to observe. He was determined to dig deeper into the culture that had allowed someone like Thomas to thrive. His approach wasn't just about rooting out one toxic leader. It was about addressing the systemic cracks that had let this toxicity fester unnoticed. By the time the office buzzed to life, Daniel was already stationed near the employee lounge, scrubbing a set of scuffed tiles. He chose this spot deliberately. It was a crossroads of sorts, a place where employees felt safe enough to chat without the prying eyes of managers. Sure enough, as the morning wore on, Small groups of employees began to gather near the coffee machine. Their conversations were light at first, weekend plans, favorite TV shows, but it didn't take long for the topic to shift to office grievances. "Did you see the email Thomas sent last night?" one woman whispered, her voice tinged with frustration. "He practically rewrote my entire report and then took credit for it in the meeting this morning." "Classic Thomas," another replied, rolling his eyes. "He's been doing that for years, and if you try to call him out on it, he'll just make your life miserable." "Yeah," the first woman said, lowering her voice even further. "I heard he got Karen reassigned last year because she refused to stay late for one of his urgent projects." Daniel kept his head down, pretending to scrub a particularly stubborn stain. His mind, however, was racing. It was becoming increasingly clear that Thomas's behavior wasn't limited to occasional outbursts. It was a calculated pattern of intimidation and manipulation. As the day progressed, Daniel made his way to different parts of the office, each area revealing its own slice of the company's culture. In the sales department, he overheard a junior associate venting to a colleague about how Thomas had publicly berated her during a team call. "I didn't even do anything wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "He just needed someone to blame because the numbers were down." Her colleague nodded sympathetically. "He's like that with everyone. It's easier to just keep your head down and stay out of his way." Daniel clenched his jaw as he wiped down a nearby window. It pained him to see his employees, people he had hired with the hope of fostering creativity and collaboration, reduced to walking on eggshells. The turning point came on a Friday afternoon during an all-hands meeting led by Thomas. As usual, Thomas dominated the room, boasting about the team's recent accomplishments while taking full credit for work he hadn't done. Daniel stood at the back of the room, pretending to adjust a piece of equipment. He watched as Thomas belittled the marketing team for missing a minor deadline, ignored questions from junior staff, and dismissed a suggestion from Raj, a tech support member, with a patronizing laugh. The final straw came when Thomas turned his ire on Sarah, accusing her of incompetence in front of the entire company. Sarah's face turned bright red, and Daniel could see tears welling up in her eyes. "That's enough," a voice said suddenly, cutting through the tension like a knife. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward the speaker. It was Daniel. He stepped forward, his posture calm but commanding, and set down the mop he had been holding. "Excuse me?" Thomas said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Who do you think you are?" Daniel straightened, his eyes locking onto Thomas's. "I think I'm someone who's seen enough." The room erupted into whispers, employees glancing at one another in confusion and shock. Daniel ignored them, his focus entirely on Thomas. "You've built your career on tearing people down," Daniel continued, his voice steady but firm. "You bully, you manipulate, and you take credit for work that isn't yours. And you've done it because you thought no one would ever hold you accountable." Thomas's face turned a deep shade of red. "You're just a janitor," he spat. "You don't have the authority to." "Actually," Daniel interrupted, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his ID badge. "I do." He held up the badge for everyone to see. The room went silent as the realization sank in. Daniel Reed, the janitor, was actually the CEO. Thomas's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Daniel turned to the rest of the room, addressing the employees who had suffered under Thomas's rule. "To all of you," he said, his voice carrying a note of both apology and resolve. "I'm sorry I let this happen, by not being here, by not paying closer attention. But that changes now." He glanced back at Thomas, whose confidence had crumbled entirely. "Effective immediately, Thomas Blake is relieved of his duties. And starting Monday, we're implementing a full review of this company's leadership practices." The room erupted into applause, a wave of relief and hope sweeping over the employees. Daniel looked around, seeing the spark of renewed trust in their eyes. It was just the beginning, but it was enough to remind him why he had started this journey in the first place, rebuilding from the ground up. In the weeks that followed, Daniel launched a company-wide initiative to address the systemic issues that had allowed a toxic culture to take root. The initiative focused on transparency, accountability, and employee empowerment, managers underwent rigorous performance reviews, and new leadership training programs were introduced. Employees were encouraged to share their experiences through anonymous surveys, focus groups, and one-on-one meetings with Daniel himself. As the months went by, the changes at Reed Innovations became more tangible. The once fractured teams began to collaborate more openly. Employees who had been silenced found their voices, and Daniel, no longer a quiet observer, led with the humility and integrity that had built the company in the first place. 1 year later, Reed Innovations was nearly unrecognizable. The toxic culture was a thing of the past, replaced by an environment of trust, collaboration, and mutual respect. And though Daniel had stepped back from the role of CEO to make way for new leaders, his legacy endured, a testament to the power of listening, humility, and the belief that true leadership comes from serving others.